Great, welcome to our Discovering History programme. This is run as a collaboration between La Trobe University, the Bendigo Goldfields Library and also the Bendigo Regional Archive Centre. My name is Dr. Emma Robertson and I'm a historian based at La Trobe University here on the Bendigo campus. I'd just like to begin though by acknowledging that we're meeting today here in person on beautiful Jara country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any First Nations people who might be here in the room or maybe joining us online. We do have an online audience as well, so who knows where people might be beaming in from. Yeah, it's a really great pleasure today to introduce this fascinating topic. Pints and protests, hotel boycotts in regional Australia from 1900 to 1950. I won't give a big long introduction, but I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Iain McIntyre. He's a historian and also a community radio announcer in Melbourne. And Iain works as a researcher and writer with the Commons Social Change Library. He's also currently working on a research project looking at the history of direct action and democracy, and that's funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. And amongst his recent publications, and this is a really great book if you haven't seen it, is the book Knocking the Top Off, A People's History of Alcohol in Australia, which he co-edited with Alex Ettling. And it is a lovely book. I don't suppose you brought copies today. You do. We have copies at the back. So if anyone would like to have a look, it is a really beautiful book. So yeah, after the session, if you'd like to go and have a look, I'm sure Iain would be happy to chat. So yeah, Iain will chat for about 40 minutes and then we'll have a Q&A. So I'll hand over without further ado. Thanks, Iain.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, so on the 8th of December 1901, up to 2,000 people gathered outside the Port Pirie Town Hall to discuss a major issue of the day, the recent increase in the pint of beer. Comprising a considerable proportion of the industrial centre's population, which at that time numbered about 9,000, so we're talking about more than 25% of the local population, the meeting was chaired by Councillor Tom Conley, who claimed nowhere in the state were publicans making such enormous profits as at Port Pirie, and it is the duty of workers to fight such an imposition. Speaker after speaker challenged hotelier claims that the rise was necessary due to the introduction of federal excises, making counterclaims of profiteering. A resolution was passed holding that, quote, no member of the workers of Port Pirie enter the local hotels until the price of beer is reduced to 4 pence a pint. And this was enthusiastically carried. This meeting made official a hotel boycott or beer strike in the parlance of the time, which had fitfully begun in response to a price rise in early November. The boycott had expanded and since reached the point where publicans' takings had reportedly shrunk from £5 to as little as 2 shillings a day. The story was picked up nationally and some newspapers commented on Port Pirie's dry heat and its reputation for heavy drinking. A columnist with the Melbourne Punch quipped, one wants to have lived at the Pirie to fully appreciate the heroic stuff the strikers are made of. The Christian martyrs aren't in it. Now, during the festive season, the boycott showed little sign of abatement and New Year's was reported as the dullest known for many years. The toll on business clearly hit hard with the result that on the 3rd of January 1902, roughly 7 weeks after the strike had unofficially begun, Port Pirie's publicans agreed to restore prices. By the following day, which coincided with smelter workers being paid, they were once more doing a roaring trade. So, social scientists Louis Hyman and Joseph Toll define consumer boycotts as events which, quote, collectively shun goods and services produced or sold by particular firms, industries, nation states or ethnic groups. Boycotts represent a form of direct action in that consumers take up an issue for themselves and rather than using courts or government bodies or some other kind of mediating group to sort out the issue. And they're a form of democratic action in that they forcibly and collectively insert consumers into decisions generally considered the prerogative of business or the market. The term boycott didn't emerge until 1880, and it came from the name of an English land agent named Captain Charles Boycott, who was targeted by Irish tenant farmers resisting eviction. However, the tactic of ostracising individuals, businesses and organisations, refusing to work with or supply them, or to purchase products from them, date back millennia. Today, we mostly think about boycotts in terms of lifestyle choices or large-scale environmental, union, peace and anti-discrimination campaigns. But historically, they were more localised, community-based events, which were often either based on industrial disputes or the cost of living. And in Australia, during the 20th century, they often involved pubs. So I first noticed this phenomena when I was researching the history of financial campaigning in Australia and came across reports of beer strikes. So at first I assumed that this was what we would normally think of a strike, I guess, in recent decades or nowadays, which was that it was probably brewery workers withdrawing their labour, going on strike. But when I dug deeper, I found out that the term in the first half of the 20th century meant the boycott of pubs. And I also discovered that this was a much wider spread phenomena and that it had a particular geographical flavour in that these strikes mainly occurred outside of major cities. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. So pub boycotts not only occurred mostly outside of the major metropolitan areas, but they also belonged to a particular era. So the research that I was doing indicated that boycotts over prices had occurred in places such as Bully and Lithgow in New South Wales in 1880 and 1881, and Allendale in Victoria in 1892. And there'd also been Shearer Union-backed boycotts steeped in racism, which had sought to remove cooks of Chinese descent from pubs in Queensland and New South Wales during 1891. It was at the beginning of the 1900s, however, that beer strikes became an annually recurring form of action, covering a wide range of issues and locations. And during 1901, there were 2 campaigns which took place across Australia, and then this rose to 9 the following year. Beer strikes then occurred each year thereafter until 40 were carried out in a single year in 1920. And they mostly targeted hotels, but also places like billiard halls which sold alcohol. 1920 not only marked an initial peak in activity, but it could also be seen as the point where, I guess, beer strikes, pub boycotts had become established enough to be a distinct option, sometimes raised as a threat, sometimes actually carried out, but basically there as an option in response to a range of grievances. And then after 1920, pub boycotts continued to occur regularly until the middle of the century. So, why were hotels a leading target of boycotts? So I'll get into the exact nature of grievances later, but broadly the existence of boycott campaigns during the 20th century and the widespread media attention that accompanied them both derived and underscore the importance of alcohol, particularly beer, in Australian life at this time. Drinking alcohol was a way of both coping with the arduous nature of labour and of enjoying it. Sorry, enjoying the fruits of it, as well as enjoying it, the alcohol. Alcohol had existed on the Australian continent prior to colonisation, but there appears to have been no large-scale production. So the culture of communal imbibing in public houses and the Australian reputation for heavy drinking was imported from Britain during colonisation and then became a core part of national identity. Although pubs were defined by their sale of alcohol, they played a much broader social role. So just as today, people gathered together to engage in conversation, play and listen to music, form sexual liaisons, play games and gamble. A stop at the pub became a routine part of everyday life, and it remained so for much of the 20th century, especially, as I'll discuss, for working class Anglo-Celtic males. So these venues provided a place for relaxation and recreation following, and in some industries during the working day. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, the pub was commonly the first structure built for community use in a new settlement. Towns would grow up around them, and pubs served multiple functions in addition to the sale and consumption of alcohol. The central role and profitability of hotels in rural and remote towns is borne out in this photo of Mount Mulligan, a town in northern Queensland, which had its own successful beer strike. And as you can see from the photo in 1910, the pub overshadows every other building in town. Public houses became known as hotels in Australia because they offered short and long-term accommodation. And this was for locals and travellers. And indeed, in many parts of Australia, a condition of getting a licence was that you provided accommodation. And they also provided sustenance during and after work, including inexpensive and often at the time free food in the form of counter meals. In regional and remote areas, they sometimes doubled as a post office, bank or general store. And to quote Alex Ettling, with whom I edited the aforementioned Knocking the Top Off People's History of Alcohol in Australia, they were a place to stable your horse and a place to store your corpse. Basically, where an alternative didn't exist, the cold cellars of the pubs were a facility which could function as a morgue. So other than providing accommodation for the living and sometimes the dead, food and services, pubs also provided a meeting place, often a formal one. So unions were quite often formed in the 1850s onwards in pubs, but sporting clubs, political parties and other groups also used these spaces. Now, their role in this respect diminished during the late 19th and early 20th century, and I'll get into a little bit more into that a little bit later, due to the influence of temperance. But also temperance and other factors meant as towns grew, they began to construct their own trades halls, church halls, mechanics institutes, theatres, libraries and the like. Nevertheless, pubs, like today, continued to host some official gatherings as well as musical and other performances. And they remained an informal place for discussions and socialising after union meetings, sports matches and events held elsewhere. And through these activities, bonds were formed with particular establishments, which meant that pubs were more than just places to access alcohol. So, why target pubs and not sellers of other commodities? I think it's because of the largely discretionary nature of spending in hotels, at least for most drinkers. And I think until the Depression years of the 1930s, the penalties associated, say, with non-payment of rent or resisting eviction generally outweighed any possible gains. And boycotting food in a small town with a single or only a small number of grocers would have been a harder task and required more planning. So particularly, as I've mentioned, in regional areas. So with alcohol, I guess there was kind of a sweet spot for boycotts in that pubs were kind of important enough to get people worked up to feel that they had to take action, yet they weren't so vital that people felt they couldn't do without them for a period. At the same time, you know, as with any other boycott, whether people could stay out of the pub for long enough or whether the publican could hold out for long enough was the crux around which disputes were won or lost. So as social and living spaces, hotels were places that expressed and influenced broader identities. So there were legal, political and social changes in the late 19th and early 20th century that created greater gender and racial segregation in Australia. Not just in the pub, but more generally. So laws and regulations governing alcohol changed as a result of concerted pressure exerted by the temperance movement. So this movement was primarily based in churches, but also to some extent in labour unions, political parties and other organisations. And it sought to limit or abolish alcohol consumption throughout society. It was successful in limiting the opening hours of pubs and also successfully reduced the number of them. And those changes were accompanied by new restrictions on gambling, the operation of theatres and dance halls, it brought in greater censorship, stricter policing of sex work, public bathing, young people smoking, and other activities. So the campaigns that targeted pubs from the temperance movement not only changed the law, but also the culture of drinking and the way in which alcohol consumption was viewed. So while First Nations people were generally banned from pubs completely, women were also targeted by campaigns and laws, and these were primarily focused on keeping them out of public bars. Public bars, of course, being the sections of pubs where drinks were sold at most affordable prices. As a result, women's drinking became more private and negatively stereotyped, and women tended to drink at home, or where they existed, they drank in ladies' lounges. And these had higher prices and generally less heavy drinking. So with women banned from public bars by dint of custom and law, these spaces became associated with white working class male drinkers. And in turn, this meant that boycotts, which generally focused on public bars, as this is where men with less money drank and drank a lot, also became the province of Anglo-Celtic males. The minority of campaigns in which women did play a part, and played a part in terms of being public speakers and joining picket lines, tended to be those in support of their industrial claims as hotel workers. Pubs had traditionally offered women greater opportunities for paid work and profit than other parts of the economy. And although some states introduced bans and major restrictions on their participation, many women continued to work in pubs as bar staff and cleaners, but they were also licensees and managers. So, what triggered a beer strike and led people to give up their favourite pastime and prime means of relaxation for weeks, months, and very occasionally years on end? Well, issues such as the cost of accommodation, treatment of workers, poor quality products, the need to address unsanitary conditions and similar things were sometimes cited, but the chief driver was undoubtedly the cost of alcohol. And the cost of beer back then typically fluctuated between 3 and 6 pence for a glass of beer in the cities and larger towns, and 6 pence to a shilling, that's 12 pence for those of us who weren't around in pre-decimal times, in the smaller and remote locations, so roughly double what it was in the bigger towns and cities. And that usually paid for an imperial pint-sized glass, 568 mils, but sometimes a smaller amount. And one of the bones of contention would be if had publicans shrunk the size of the glasses, was the glass genuinely a pint? So I won't go into, average earnings and so forth in this era, but enough to say a few glasses of beer after work and more on the weekend constituted enough of a proportion of the cost of living for any price rise to have an impact. And beer strikes were often in response to proposed or unexpected price rises, and these were commonly on the order of 25 to 100%, or reductions, as I said, in the glass sizes. In other cases, price reductions sometimes followed years of stability, but they were demanded by drinkers on the basis of alcohol being cheaper in other locations. So during a 1903 dispute in Fayetteville, which was a small town located on West Australia's goldfields, strikers adopted the watchword Kalgoorlie prices, as drinkers were paying half the price for a pint in that town only 30 kilometres away. Beer striker demands for fair pricing were often framed around contemporary ideas, typically drawn from the union movement, regarding reward for effort, standards of living, and that prices should be relative to rates of pay. So, for instance, in the WA goldfields town of Kukinai, and in this research I discovered a lot of small places with interesting names that I'd never heard of. Anyway, in Kukinai in 1903, miners responded to a wage cut by demanding that publicans reduce prices from a shilling to 6 pence a pint. During a 4-week boycott, hundreds of people joined rallies outside pubs, including the one seen here, and they were picketed by patrols who wrote down the names of boycott breakers. In an innovative move, some strikers demonstrated how much money hoteliers were losing by opening saving accounts and then parading down the street with bank books tied into their buttonholes. Now, this potentially undermined their argument that wage cuts were having an effect, but the boycott was nevertheless successful. During a 1910 campaign in WA, the chairman of the Beer Strike Committee argued that the campaign, quote, was a case pure and simple of the worker fighting for himself against the capitalist, with access to cheap beer, something to which they were entitled. So, beyond the existence of consumer grievances, two other factors typically made the undertaking of a beer strike more likely: location and union affiliation. So the overwhelming number of campaigns took place in regional and often remote communities. These places were more likely only either to have one pub or to have a small number of hotels which could act in cartel-like fashion to set shared prices. As in other small segmented markets, a lack of competition and choice made it difficult for consumers to simply up sticks and go to the next pub. At the same time, rural hotels had a small localised consumer base, and this made them particularly vulnerable to boycotts. Many of the smallest towns or aggregations were also demographically dominated by men, working in newly established mines or in seasonal agricultural work, such as shearing or harvesting. In places where physical labour was hard, pubs often provided one of the few sites of relief. Also, heavy drinking amongst these workers, including binges at the end of an intensive working period or when money had been saved up, was a regular part of their work culture. This and the ability to display masculine camaraderie through buying drinks for others, shouting, was threatened by increases in the price of alcohol and the other goods and services that hotels offered. Being in a smaller community also allowed agitation to reach the bulk of the population more easily. At the same time, local feeling had to be sustained because if it went against the boycott or a majority tired of it, then it could easily crumble. So, just check if I'm on the right slide. So the second most common factor associated with action was the involvement of unionists and workers in industries and areas with a high union density. So areas that experienced the most pub boycotts included New South Wales Far West Outback, the Hunter Valley and South Coast in New South Wales, West Australia's Goldfields, Queensland's North, and Port Pirie in South Australia. And it may have been that the term beer strike emerged and was stuck with because of union involvement or because it was felt that union members would be more likely to respect and support action described as a strike. And this kind of motivational nature of this term and the importance of sticking to collective decisions was summed up by the secretary of a boycott committee at Collie in WA in 1901. And they said, "A coal miner loved a strike as much as he loved his life, and he would often be heard speaking of what he would do for a strike and how he would deny himself. I voted against it. I myself voted against it. But once it was put to the vote and the meeting decided in favour of the strike, I consider it as my duty to work heart and soul to pull it off, and I shall do so." So beer strikes were generally run at a grassroots level by ad hoc committees headed by prominent local residents, and these included union branch leaders and organisers. Despite the involvement of unionists, for the most part, the larger regional, state and federal union bodies and their leaderships were either uninvolved or refused to take an official position on beer strikes unless they directly involved workplace issues. This was partially due to orientation and coverage, but they may have also avoided it because beer strikes could become quite divisive in the local community. And they were also difficult to control and predict outcomes. So having said this, unions were sometimes involved at a branch level, and this was where decisions were most likely to reflect local feeling. So here in Bendigo, during January 1920, the Miners Association passed a motion protesting recent beer price rises and called on its members to refrain from drinking in protest. And they only needed to do this not even for an entire week, because publicans quickly moved to reduce prices back down to those seen in Melbourne. Now, as I mentioned, campaign bodies that ran these strikes were often short-lived and kind of thrown together, but at the same time, they based their decision-making and their organisation on forms that had been learnt in union branches, political parties, and early closing associations. Campaigners also adopted tactical elements which were usually used in industrial and other disputes. And so this is how a dispute usually played out. There'd be some level of kind of informal discussion, moaning, etc. in the community. And then somebody would call a meeting. The meeting would be held open to the public. And these were usually held inside, not in the pub, but usually inside a hall, a union or club rooms, or outdoors in a park, on the street or on a street corner. They'd be promoted via word of mouth, posters, stories in the local press, chalked up messages, handbills, banners, and newspaper advertisements. And these were all the ways that people regularly, if they were taking kind of action around issues, would kind of get the word out. I found it interesting that the meetings were generally quite formal affairs. So they would elect a chairperson, they'd have an agenda, issues and responses would be debated and discussed, a log of claims and resolutions would be passed, organising committees and subcommittees elected. Typically there was a vote of thanks to the chairperson at the end of each meeting. Sometimes the hoteliers would be invited to the meeting to put their point of view, but more typically a delegation would form, visit them with the formal set of demands, and then outline the consequences of rejecting them. So there was a strong level of organisation, like in any kind of boycott, was needed for them to be successful. And this can be seen in a 1914 meeting that was held in Bendigo. 200 people assembled at the market sheds in response to an advertisement which had been placed in the local newspaper, calling for action against a recent increase in the price of beer and cordials. However, the convener failed to appear. Nobody else stood up and the crowd soon dissipated. Where crowds didn't dissipate and people did decide to go on boycotts, once it was clear that it was going to go ahead, petitions and lists of beer strikers would be taken. And this was to publicly demonstrate the level of support, but also to kind of encourage people to stay the course. Resolutions and demands were promoted, and they often included agreement stating what would happen for beer strikers if they strayed. And most typically that was having your name being written on a roll of honour, as we have up here, which could be posted in public. At other times, boycott breakers would be expected to pay a fine to charity, which might be 6p or £1. Now, whether pubs were picketed or not varied quite widely. If picketing happened, then it was usually formally organised, again, via meetings and committees. People would block the entrance to the pub, write down the name of anybody who insisted on pushing through. Boycott breakers were often shunned in public, but consequences could also reach into the workplace. So during a successful dispute across New South Wales Maitland coalfields in 1915, workers from at least 9 towns and suburbs boycotted hotels over prices. And exhibiting the kind of solidarity, discipline and peer pressure which we would see in industrial strikes, there were reports that, quote, "The man who breaks away will have no mates at the cage or at the pit." So Now, whether or not a pub boycott was successful, and this is true of most boycotts, stem not only from the depth of grievances and the severity of penalties for people who broke ranks, but also whether consumers could find ready and visible alternatives. So, as I mentioned before, much of regional social life revolved around pubs, and so having something else for people to do was particularly important. If one pub hadn't risen prices or had caved in, people would flock there. And that will put more pressure on the ones that were holding out. And similarly, hotels in nearby towns often reported increased sales. But where a legitimate hotel was unavailable, strikes patronised wine bars, soft drink shops, or bought takeaway alcohol from grocers. In some cases, supplies of alcohol were legally bought by strikers in other towns or sent in solidarity by supporters. So during one WA Goldfields dispute, barrels of beer were brought in from Menzies to nearby Malene, and then the beer strikers visited each banned pub to pay them a toast, which is a good point at which for me to take a drink. And as you can see, in one of the headlines here, Port Pirie wharfies turned to eating apples rather than downing beers during work breaks. And people also turned to milk. So strikers also found other ways to fill the vacuum in entertainment. Parades, open air and indoor meetings, sports matches and public debates all promoted the cause while occupying time which otherwise would have been spent in the pub. Some events were accompanied by musical performances, including soloists and brass, drum and fife bands. And it was in this way that people kept themselves entertained. So publicans responded to the threat and reality of declining profits, picketing and poor publicity in various ways. So they would put advertisements in the paper, they would make statements to journalists, and in their discussions with strikers and other members of the public, they'd counter accusations that they were greedy and profiteering. A recurring argument from the publicans was that the cost of alcohol, meal and accommodation was largely outside of their control. And increased prices were instead sheeted home to brewers, landlords and transport companies. They also cited licensing costs, taxes and excises, staff wages. Strikers would often demand that the publicans open their books to justify such claims, and this was usually denied unless it was seen to be to their advantage. In a similar way to beer strikers, some licensed victuallers associations tried to maintain discipline through levying fines against members. So, for instance, as part of an arrangement in 1920 to raise the price of accommodation by 8 shillings, hoteliers at Gordonvale, Queensland, each placed £20 in a fund. And there was an agreement that if any of them broke their ranks, that £20 would go to the local ambulance fund. Despite this, one of the 5 publicans immediately capitulated when the anticipated beer strike began. Now, most publicans basically just chose to wait out their opponents. But in a minority of cases, they employed their own coercive means. So they did this by threatening to cut off credit, increase the price of accommodation, or remove counter meals should they lose a dispute. And occasionally things could become quite heated. Claims were made in 1914 that during a beer strike at isolated Burketown in Queensland's Gulf of Carpentaria, hoteliers had prevailed by cutting off strikers' access to drinking water. And northern Queensland saw outbreaks of violence and the arrest of beer strikers during a number of disputes that followed World War I. And this was a time in northern Queensland, Queensland in general, of a fair bit of political and social tumult. And there was a widespread campaign to try and improve conditions for women bar workers. So in one example, a 19-month dispute, it's a 19-month long boycott, broke out in Hewenden. over the non-payment of overtime to women hotel workers in 1919. And before it ended in success and the women were paid back their overtime, boycott organisers were beaten and evicted from town, and 60 carters were sacked in Townsville when their unions refused to transport beer to Hewenden. And in this photo, you can see a police inspector and local pastoralists and business people posing outside the Central Hotel during the boycott. Now, most beer strikes were events occurring in one location, but sometimes a victory or shared complaint could see them spread and become much larger. In 1925, one of West Australia's biggest beer strikes began on April the 29th. This was 15 days after the state had overwhelmingly voted in a referendum to reject prohibition. During the referendum, the liquor trade had promised that security for the industry would bring down alcohol prices should prohibition be defeated. Well, prohibition was defeated and prices did not change. So one result of this was that a street meeting was held in Bunbury, 170 kilometres south of Perth, and strikers resolved to mount pickets outside of pubs and photograph anyone crossing them. And I guess this is the time when photography was becoming available enough to use in this kind of way. So it started in Bunbury, but within days, meetings had been held in fringe towns and outer suburban parts of Perth, such as Midland Junction, Guildford, Maylands, Bayswater and Bassendean, all of which moved motions to extend the boycott. And then further south, pubs also emptied in St Ives, Wokalup, Collie, Harvey and other towns. So these represented a backlash over broken promises concerning prices, but they coincided with strikes in central Perth and Fremantle. These were industrial strikes, and they were held by members of the Hotel, Club, Caterers, Tea Room and Restaurant Employees Union, quite a long title that one, which saw eateries, hostels and pubs black banned for employing strike breakers. So you had this boycott and picket lines happening in the centre of Perth, then on the fringes of Perth and then down the south. Now, this widespread boycott underlines the difficulty of maintaining such large boycotts for a long period of time. And all of the disputes over prices began to decline after about the 6-week mark. And after the boycott campaign ended, an agreement was reached in Bunbury to reduce takeaway prices, but otherwise the boycotts on this occasion failed. Now, a much bigger beer strike wave occurred during World War II, and this was a time when there was increased alcohol excises, high prices, limits on the production of alcohol, reductions in the size of glasses, and limits on when schooners could be sold, and all of that fed into overall discontent around rationing and living standards. Unlike most of the beer strikes I've discussed, these were often supported by trades and labour councils and the leadership of unions. So starting in December 1940 in Junee and then extending to the Illawarra, Sydney, Cessnock, Broken Hill, the Blue Mountains and other locales, the boycotts took in a significant part of New South Wales, and they involved tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of drinkers at their peak. One boycott spokesperson in the Riverina declared, quote, "Empty hotels are as cold as morgues these hot days, but we will not enter them, even if we have to hold out until Judgment Day." Protesters in Leeton were reported as having cheered when a local publican was forced to pour 250 gallons of beer literally down the drain because it had gone sour. Now, drinkers in Junee, Hay, the Illawarra, Broken Hill and Collinsville all secured cheaper beer at this time, but other areas met with less success. Nevertheless, boycott after boycott was called, with the overall wave of protests lasting roughly 4 months. During this time, a boycott also broke out in Darwin, and despite claims that this would force the pubs to close for good, not only were old prices restored, but union officials won the right to check the size of glasses. There were also boycotts in various towns in WA and Queensland during early 1941. And a possible pub boycott in Bendigo was foreshadowed by the Trades Hall Council. But in the end, it opted for a public meeting regarding tax and price rises across a range of products, including food, milk, tobacco, and beer. All in all, as you can see on the slide, the combination of boycotts and price rises saw beer consumption fall by 15% at the peak of the strike wave. And drinkers consumed 4.7 million litres less beer in January 1941 than in the previous year's January. Okay, so the result of many beer strikes is unknown. I surveyed 181 regional disputes from 1901 to 1920 for an article in the journal Labour History. And of those, only 82 had a clear conclusion. 53 won all or the majority of their demands, and 29 failed to do so. Duration appears to have had an impact. Shorter boycotts were more likely to succeed, whereas results were more evenly balanced in struggles lasting more than a fortnight. This may have simply reflected a more even balance of power from the start, but it also suggests that abstaining from drink was difficult to maintain over time. Now, although strikes were reactive and hastily organised, or at least most of them were, some were planned well in advance. Concerns regarding timing were occasionally factored into decisions, such as at Broken Hill in 1920, when it was argued that action should be deferred because the Christmas period was coming up and also people were exhausted from a recent mining strike. Weather and holidays were often referred to in news articles and occasionally by workers themselves as a make or break factor. But the connection was not so straightforward. One Port Pirie campaigner stated in 1920 that, quote, "We have the advantage of cold weather. It is highly unlikely that anything of this kind would have been attempted in summer, for then the chances are that the opposition would collapse." Well, this campaign was one, of course, that promptly went on to lose. But in contrast, many beer strikes lasted through the heat of summer, and some even survived the Christmas and New Year holidays. The timing of boycotts in these respects had the potential to influence outcomes, but more important was the quality of organisational efforts on each side, the ability of hotels to weather the loss of trade, and the degree of striker and community cohesion. These were most decisive. All right, so that's the talk. I'll just finish by saying, if you want to find out more about the history of protest in Australia, then please visit commonslibrary.org, which is a website with over 1,500 resources for campaigners. You can also check out Knocking the Top Off, A People's History of Alcohol in Australia, published by Interventions Press. I'd like to thank the library for having me talk, to Emma Robertson for inviting me to do so, and to the Gerda Hancock Foundation for supporting my research work. Cheers.
Thanks so much for that, Ian. Great, lovely pictures as well. Great to get a few mentions of Bendigo in. That's always appreciated. So I'd like to throw it open to the floor for questions, and also we might have some questions online. We do have a roving microphone, so if anyone would like to ask a question.
I have a question.
You have one? I was going to say, otherwise I can go. You go.
How often did the beer strikes end up becoming something bigger in terms of striking for groceries, or when did it become bigger, basically?
Very rarely. There were, I can't think of the towns straight off the top of my head, but there were a couple of instances where there were sort of discussions in local papers going, where will this end? The madness, will it extend to everything else? But it was very unusual. There was some cases that I found where people were boycotted, but it was more like in that West Australian strike wave. I think it was in Midland Junction, the local tailor crossed the picket line. Now, they said, oh, I'm not crossing the picket line to get a beer, I'm just delivering a suit. But nevertheless, their tailor shop got boycotted. So the boycotts extended if it was because of other business people supporting the publicans, but it didn't tend to, it was only a few cases where it extended. Actually, one was in Walloona where people also struck against the local cinema. And I think that sort of underlines that it was often about these discretionary issues. Now, having said that, separate to beer strikes, during the 1930s, eviction resistance and non-payment of rent became quite a huge sort of economic issue. And I guess that was a boycott or resistance to paying rent simply because people couldn't pay. And I suppose in that kind of case, it pushed the risks of taking action. It was like, well, homelessness or don't pay rent. But for some reason, beer was the was the focus. And again, I think it's that discretionary nature of it.
Sort of an outlet of frustration that people could afford to do.
Yeah, and I think beer was important, as I said. Like, people cared enough about it, and it wasn't even just, I guess, beer, because it was very rare that there were boycotts of takeaway sales. So it was about, we want to be in this place and it can be affordable and we can spend the whole night or whatever. Or they just thought it was outrageous. You've doubled the prices. But as I say, I think groceries and food would have been more difficult.
Oh, yeah, question up the back. Geordie's just on his way with the microphone. Give him a sec.
With the ladies' lounges, and you were saying the beer cost more in there, why didn't they strike over that? And when did they finish, the ladies' lounges? I can remember they were around in the 70s.
Yeah, so I think there was this shift during temperance where, and it was probably wider than temperance, but certainly part of temperance, that, drinking on the part of women became something shameful. Whereas even though they were trying to shame men as well, that didn't work. And in fact, it in some ways intensified men's drinking, particularly with the 6 o'clock swill where pubs had to close at 6, so people would rush out of work. Men would drink as much as they possibly could and then, go and have a car crash or whatever. But we sort of see the nature of boycotts change in the late 60s and early 70s, and women and First Nations people started demanding access to be in the parts of pubs where drinks were cheaper and where men drank. And so there were boycotts of individual pubs more in that kind of period. And I guess that was a cultural shift through the 50s and 60s. Women started drinking in pubs more, but still in these kind of family spaces or ladies' lounges. And then from the late 60s, early 70s, with the second wave of feminism, there was this push to like, no, we want to have cheap drinks too. So, yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, women working in pubs generally and owning pubs continued after the temperance, but in some states it was quite, like in South Australia, women were banned from working in pubs. And in Victoria, they were generally, they sort of brought in this kind of halfway measure where it was like, you can only work in a pub if you're over 30, with the idea that the number of women over time would reduce. But then during World War II, they had a shortage of labour to work in pubs, and the unions were able to force publicans to hire women again. So it was up and down, but yes, you had women proprietresses, or how should you pronounce it. And often, you see in the various stories that the licensee who's being boycotted, is a woman.
Yeah, in the middle.
Just stay here.
Sorry, this is a question about boycotts now. You sound like you've got a fairly good handle on, the sort of early history of Australia. Thinking about people buying Teslas and people buying bourbon or not buying bourbon or not buying Teslas. Do you think there's a place for boycotts in in the modern world when we consume so differently, when unionism is not quite such an integral part of our lives? You've got some thoughts about that?
I think there's definitely was a shift from well, certainly beer strikes sort of died out in the 50s as a phenomenon, then came back as I was saying with women and First Nations people demanding access to pubs. Yeah, boycotts are definitely still very much part of how people show their displeasure and how they try to push back against things. But it has, as I mentioned at the beginning, I guess it's become often on a larger scale. Like you still get some individual businesses being boycotted. I think it was the Katani bar, and hopefully I'm not smearing anybody here, but I remember in the 1990s, one of the bars in St Kilda refused to sell alcohol to Aboriginal people, and the singer of Yothi Yindi went in there for a drink, wasn't allowed in there, and then people boycotted the pub. The pub then changed its rules. And certainly there's been boycotts of pubs by Aboriginal people in various outback places. But now these days, I guess a lot of boycotts tend to be large scale, and that can interfere with their success, because if you've got a small market, there's only one product, there's another product you can consume, you can kind of really put that pressure on. Whereas if you've got a really big company, they can be harder to financially coerce. At the same time, big corporations are often very concerned about, you know, their brand and their identity and so forth. So there's the possibility with that. And I guess we saw that with, yes, Woolworths. And I was also thinking in relation to beer, Coopers. One of their owners or whatever put money into the campaign against marriage equality, and so they were kind of boycotted by people. So, but yeah, it's much more on a sort of corporate or larger scale now.
Sorry, I was just. Do anything?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I was just going to mention Woolworths with the Australian flag. Yeah, they didn't sell the Australian flag, and their stocks and everything went down. They hurt. Yeah, they felt it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Michelle, you've got a question?
Excuse me. I was just wondering why there's sort of more beer strikes in regional regions. Has it got something to do with the fact that, like in the early 20th century, we get the rise of big corporations like Carlton United, and Carlton United, I mean, I know they always maintained that they never had tied hotels, but it's pretty hard to deal with a boycott if you've got a tied hotel, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I think there's two things I'd say. One is the brewers definitely came to dominate hotels more, but in the discussions that you see in the media of the time, when the argument was made like we can't do anything, it's the brewer, then people often still said, well, you're the point of sale, so we hurt the brewer through you. So I guess that's the brewer side of it. The side of it being more in the regional areas, I think, as I mentioned, like it was harder for people to go somewhere else. So you've only got two pubs and they both put up their prices. You've either got to travel 50 or 100 kilometres to the next town, or you put pressure on the local pub. I think the other factor, as I mentioned, was that, you know, a lot of the newer communities were often very male dominated. So there's a lot of men. They're spending a lot of time at the pub. The pub sort of has a kind of higher place in life than it would be in a place where people have families and so forth. And I think the other factor was that pubs were more vulnerable in a smaller town, because if everyone stops drinking there, yeah, they're in more trouble. Thanks.
Sorry, people online won't have.
Yeah. Sorry, it's amazing here. We had someone visit a couple of nights ago, and they were talking about the price of a beer, how it's 3 different pubs. There's a difference over $1.50 between the 3 different pubs. That's today.
Yeah.
Julia, questions behind.
Yes.
So I'm from the eastern suburbs up in the Dandenongs. Up there, just this is not regarding boycotts necessarily, but the temperance in the when I was growing up, it was a dry area out there, all the way like Blackburn, Ringwood, Belgrave. You know, there was like 2 pubs in this huge area. They had a massive impact. I can't think, it was some denomination of religious denomination. Anyway, it's very different now, but yeah. I was also wondering about the people in the regional areas. Were they cognizant of the prices that people were paying in the city and kind of going, how come we're paying this much and the people in the city are paying this much?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think in Bendigo, the case I mentioned, people wanted Melbourne prices. So yeah, people would be aware of what the prices were in other places and would want them brought down to be sort of similar. And sometimes it will be related to things like, if there hadn't been a railway previously, people might accept, okay, you've got to pay more for transport or whatever. You can't transport as much alcohol here, but hey, now there's the train can just bring it here. So, why not have the same prices as the next train on the next town on the next train stop?
Is there any questions online as well, Geordie, just in case? Yeah, you go, Charles, and just check.
I was just wondering, because recently today I was reading a report of a sort of boycott of a mine in Bendigo in 1907 over searching miners for stolen gold. But I noticed in that strike, the publicans did a different thing. They supported the strikers by supplying beer. And I wonder if that was a sort of common practice also.
Yeah, I think it varied. There were definitely, and again, I can't pull them straight out of my head, but there were definitely some towns where Collie might have been, actually Collie was one, which is a coal town in West Australia, where the publicans came out and said, well, we're pretty annoyed that you've done this. When the last strike was on, we didn't cut off your credit or whatever. So we won't do that again. So yes, it could have that backlash.
There's a couple of things in the chat. One from Stephen. We're talking about an era when there were many more individual breweries around rather than, a few brewing companies. Wondering whether there was any consistency in what the breweries were charging the publicans for the beer, or was it all over the place?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that one. Certainly there was that rough pricing that I kind of mentioned, but I only really so much aware at the actually I can think of one case now that I think about it. Wonthaggi had a workers club. It was quite a strong union town, so I'm not sure exactly whether this was the 10s, the 20s, or the 30s. But yes, the brewers told everybody in town that the prices were going up, and basically the one place that held out was the workers' club, and they said, no, we're not going to pay this. And people agreed who were involved with that club not to drink anywhere else in town, so that all the pubs would be kind of pressured to hold out against the brewer. But from memory, they didn't win. They held out for a while, but basically the brewery just, cut off their supplies and, they weren't able to hold out.
There's another comment from Jenny. In our family pub in Bendigo in the 70s, during a beer strike, beer was brought in all the way from South Australia.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether that was a pub boycott or a brewery strike, but I know that at times there was a strike of CUB in the 60s, and the union was hit quite heavily with fines because we had a period where unions could strike easily and without any kind of major fines and stuff.
Gone are the days.
But that's not the case now, and it wasn't the case in the 60s. So, yeah, basically the pubs were getting around the beer strike by bringing in beer from New South Wales, but they were still exporting beer to other states. And one of the things that the union did was just say, well, they managed to convince the transport unions not to transport beer anywhere else. And that put enough pressure on CUB to kind of deal with the union's demands.
We are oh, there's one there. Yeah, so probably time for one last question. Thank you.
Less of a comment, question, more of a comment. I was digging through the Bendigo Easter Fair records a while ago in the newspapers, and I kept coming across notices about the temperance unions of Bendigo. Can't remember which one in particular, who kept petitioning the Easter Fair Council to put their temperance tent in the middle of the beer tents in the park. To drum up more temperance support, and sometimes they got there and then had some notable failures in getting anyone to come in to drink their milk and cordial and soft drink. I just thought that was a nice note.
Yeah, well, look, it was definitely a debate. I know certainly around the, the origins of Labor Day is in the 8-hour celebrations, and there are often debates in the unions about whether they would have a beer tent or not. And in fact, today, quite strangely, when we were on our way here, we were behind a bus which had an anti-vaping ad which said, literally, vaping isn't cool. And then at the bottom, I saw WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So I guess they still have some kind of presence here in Bendigo.
It's really interesting. Yes. Thanks, Ian. And yeah, I had questions too, but there were so many great questions. I will get those later from you. Thanks to everyone for engaging and for those people online. It's been a really great presentation. I'd like to just advertise our next session. Our final session for the year is on the 27th of November. And that's our La Trobe colleague, Jennifer Jones, who will be talking about the Brown family letters. It's a collection of letters related to a Scottish migrant family here in Bendigo. Her title is Remarrying Religion and the Victorian Goldfields. So it should be a really great session if you come and join us then. But thanks again to Ian, and thanks again for you all for joining us tonight.
Right, let's go.